It has been conquered 44 times, destroyed 17, rebuilt from rubble 16. No city on earth has absorbed this much force and continued to exist. Not Rome, not Athens, not Babylon, which is dust, not Constantinople, which changed its name to survive. Jerusalem kept its name, kept its location, kept its claim on the imagination of the entire human species. That is not a religious miracle, it is a structural one. And to understand it, you have to stop thinking about Jerusalem as a holy city and start thinking about it as an organism that discovered, very early in its existence, a survival mechanism no other city has ever fully replicated. It weaponized meaning. It made itself so symbolically necessary to so many different systems of power that destroying it completely became, for every empire that tried, more costly than controlling it. That strategy has worked for 3,000 years. It is also the reason the city has never, in 3,000 years, been at peace. Most cities survive because of what they produce: trade routes, agricultural surplus, military capacity, industrial output. Jerusalem produces almost none of these things in meaningful quantity. It sits in the hills of the southern Levant, away from the major trade arteries of the ancient world. It has no navigable river, no natural harbor. The land around it is rocky and difficult to farm at scale. By the conventional logic of urban geography, Jerusalem should not have survived. What it had instead was something more durable than any of those material advantages. It had claim. 3 of the world's largest religious traditions, traditions that between them have shaped the belief systems of more than 4 billion living people. Each trace a foundational moment to this specific hill, in this specific city. That concentration of meaning is not coincidental. It accumulated over centuries through a specific historical logic. Each new power that arrived in Jerusalem found it strategically advantageous to honor what was already there, while adding its own layer on top. The result is a city that functions like sedimentary rock. Each layer of conquest compressed the layers below it. Each layer of belief added weight to what preceded it. The city did not survive despite being fought over. It survived because of it, but meaning does not emerge from nothing. It has to attach itself to something physical, something a person can walk toward, stand on, touch. The question is what this particular hill had that made it the one. The geography of the southern Levant is a corridor. On one side, the Mediterranean. On the other, the Syrian desert and the Arabian Peninsula. Between them, a strip of land narrow enough that every empire moving between Africa, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia had no choice but to pass through it. Jerusalem does not sit on the main road through this corridor. The coastal highway, the Via Maris of the ancient world, ran closer to the sea. But Jerusalem sits on the central ridge that runs the length of the corridor like a spine. And in a world where elevation was military advantage, this position was worth more than proximity to a trade road. From the Judean hills, you can see approaching armies before they see you. You can defend with fewer soldiers than you need in open terrain. You can cut supply lines moving north and south along the coast simply by controlling the high ground. This is why, around 1000 BC, a military leader named David chose this specific hilltop as the capital of a unified kingdom, not because it was beautiful, not because it was already wealthy, because it was defensible, central, and belonged to no single tribe, making it politically neutral ground in a fragmented political landscape. The strategic logic was sound. What David could not have anticipated was what his son would build on that hill next, and what that building would set in motion for the next 3,000 years. David chose the hill for military reasons. What his son built on it had nothing to do with military logic, and that is precisely why it changed everything. Solomon's temple was not the largest structure in the ancient world. The Egyptians had been building on a larger scale for 1,000 years before it was constructed. What made it consequential was not its size. It was its function. The temple was designed as the singular earthly location of the divine presence, not a place to worship a God who existed everywhere. The specific place where the God of Israel could be directly approached. Sacrifices made here counted in ways that sacrifices made elsewhere did not. Prayers spoken here carried weight that prayers spoken elsewhere lacked. This theological architecture, the idea that one physical location was irreplaceable in the structure of a relationship between a people and their God, created something no military fortification could replicate. It created a city that its own people could not abandon without spiritual consequence. Even when they were forced to leave, by conquest, by exile, by displacement, they carried Jerusalem with them as an obligation, a place they were required to return to, a direction to face when they prayed. The temple transformed Jerusalem from a military asset into a biological imperative. For the people whose identity was anchored to it, the city could not cease to exist. It could only be temporarily occupied by the wrong people. Every empire that took Jerusalem would eventually have to reckon with that logic. The same symbolic power that made Jerusalem indispensable to its own people made it a target for every regional power that understood what controlling sacred cities meant. In the political language of the ancient Near East, holding Jerusalem was a statement. It meant you held not just a city but a claim on the loyalty of populations far beyond your military reach, on the narrative of divine sanction that legitimized political authority across the region. By the 7th century BCE, three major powers were converging on the Levant corridor simultaneously: Assyria from the north, Egypt from the south, and Babylon rising in the east. Jerusalem had been surviving in the gaps between these pressures for 3 centuries. But the organism had a structural weakness that its symbolic power could not compensate for. It was small, its population was finite. Its water supply, the Gahan Spring, lay outside the original city walls, accessible to any besieging army that simply chose to wait. King Hezekiah understood this. Around 701 BC, he commissioned the construction of a tunnel through solid rock, 533 meters of hand-cut limestone, to redirect the spring's water inside the city walls. It was one of the most sophisticated engineering projects of the ancient world. It bought Jerusalem another century. It could not buy a third. The tunnel bought time. It could not buy allies. It could not buy grain for a city under siege. And it could not stop what was already moving west from Babylon. In 587 BC, Nebuchadnezzar's Babylonian army did what no force had managed for 3 centuries. It broke through. The temple was burned. The walls were demolished. The city's leadership was taken to Babylon in chains. The population that remained was left in the ruins of a city that had, by every conventional measure, ceased to exist. But here the survival mechanism activated in a way no one anticipated. The destruction of the temple did not end Jerusalem's claim on the people exiled from it. It intensified it. In Babylon, the exiled community produced some of the most consequential religious literature in human history. Texts that reinterpreted the destruction, not as divine abandonment, but as a temporary condition. A test, a cycle that would complete itself when the people returned and rebuilt. Jerusalem, physically absent, became more powerful as an idea than it had been as a city. The organism had discovered something extraordinary. It could survive destruction by converting the memory of destruction into a mandate for reconstruction. No empire that raised Jerusalem ever managed to erase it. They only wrote the next chapter. When the Persian Empire displaced Babylon, the exiles were permitted to return. The temple was rebuilt, smaller, less magnificent than the first, but structurally and theologically continuous with it. Then came Alexander, then the Ptolemies, then the Seleucids, then the Maccabean revolt that temporarily restored Jewish political autonomy, then Rome. Each of these transitions followed the same pattern. A new power arrived. assessed what Jerusalem meant to the populations it needed to govern, and generally chose to preserve the temple rather than destroy it. Herod the Great, appointed king of Judea by Rome around 37 BC, understood this logic better than anyone. He doubled the size of the Temple Mount platform, constructing retaining walls so massive that sections of them are still standing 2,000 years later. He rebuilt the temple itself in white marble and gold. He made Jerusalem one of the most spectacular cities in the Roman world. This was not piety. It was political engineering. By making the temple more magnificent than it had ever been, Herod made himself indispensable to the population whose loyalty Rome needed. He used the sacred geography as infrastructure for his own authority. But the pressure between Roman administrative logic and the theological independence that Jerusalem's sacred status implied was building beneath the surface. It had been building for a century. In 66 AD, it erupted. What Rome did next was the most systematic attempt in the ancient world to permanently end a city's identity. It failed. But understanding why it failed requires understanding what Rome actually built on the ruins, and what arrived 3 centuries later to build on top of that. In 70 AD, Rome destroyed the Second Temple. The Jewish population was dispersed across the empire. Jerusalem was rebuilt as a Roman city, renamed Aelia Capitolina, its sacred topography overwritten with Roman temples and urban planning. It was the most thorough attempt in the ancient world to permanently end a city's identity by erasing its physical and symbolic foundations. It did not work. Within 3 centuries, a new empire, now Christian Rome, arrived in Jerusalem and found that the sacred geography it needed for its own legitimacy required not erasing the city's history, but incorporating it. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, constructed in the 4th century under Constantine, was built directly over the site that Christian tradition associated with the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. The city was reorganized around a new sacred center. But the reorganization did not erase what came before. It compressed it. Then in 637 AD, Muslim armies entered Jerusalem. The Caliph Umar refused to pray inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, specifically because he did not want his followers to claim it as a mosque. He prayed outside. It was a deliberate act of restraint, a recognition that Jerusalem's survival depended on its sacred geography remaining accessible to the populations whose loyalty it commanded. The Dome of the Rock, completed in 691 AD, on the Temple Mount, was not built to erase what came before. It was built to assert a new layer while preserving the weight of the old ones. Every conqueror who understood Jerusalem understood this logic. The ones who didn't, who tried to erase rather than add, are the ones history recorded as failures. In December 1917, British General Edmund Allenby entered Jerusalem on foot. It was a calculated gesture. He understood, as every general who had ever approached this city understood, that how you enter Jerusalem matters as much as whether you enter it. The Ottoman Empire had governed Jerusalem for 400 years. Its end in the Levant did not simplify the city's political situation. It inaugurated the most complex phase of Jerusalem's 3,000-year history. The 20th century brought to Jerusalem something the ancient world had not fully developed: the concept of national self-determination. The idea that specific peoples had rights to specific territories based on historical, cultural, or religious connection. Jerusalem concentrated this concept to an impossible density. The same square kilometer contained foundational claims from multiple national and religious traditions, each with documented historical presence, each with populations numbering in the hundreds of millions who understood the city's fate as connected to their own identity. The organism that had survived by making itself symbolically necessary to successive empires now found itself at the center of a political structure, the modern nation-state system, that had no mechanism for managing a city that was simultaneously claimed as a capital by more than one sovereign entity. The ancient survival strategy was working too well. Jerusalem had made itself indispensable to too many systems at once. That indispensability is not a solved problem. It is the problem. And when we look at Jerusalem today, we are not looking at the resolution of 3,000 years of competing claims. We are looking at what those claims look like when they have nowhere left to expand. When we look at Jerusalem today, we are not looking at a city in crisis. We are looking at a city operating exactly as it always has, at maximum symbolic pressure, with no resolution in sight, surviving precisely because resolution would require one of its competing claims to be invalidated. And invalidating a claim that 4 billion people consider foundational to their identity is not a political problem. It is a structural impossibility. The Western Wall draws tens of thousands of Jewish worshippers daily. The Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque serve as the third holiest site in Islam. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is the most sacred location in Christianity. These three sites are within a 10-minute walk of each other. No city on earth carries this density of irreplaceable meaning in such a small physical space. That concentration is not a vulnerability. It is the mechanism. As long as Jerusalem remains simultaneously essential to multiple global systems of belief and political identity, no single power can eliminate it without damaging itself in the process. The city is protected not by its walls. It is protected by the cost of its destruction. Every city in this series has survived by transforming. London survived by rebuilding after fire and bombs. Istanbul survived by changing its name, its faith, its political structure. Kyoto survived by refusing to compete. Venice survived by building an engineering system to hold back the sea. Cairo survived by splitting itself in two. Jerusalem survived by doing none of these things. It survived by remaining, with extraordinary consistency, exactly what it had always been. The place where the claims of faith and the logic of power collide in a space too small to contain either one comfortably. That collision has never produced peace. It has produced continuous existence, which, across 3,000 years of recorded history, may be the closest any city gets to permanence. The organism did not evolve a new strategy for each new threat. It discovered one strategy early, and it held to it with a consistency that has outlasted every empire that tried to overwrite it. Jerusalem has been destroyed, rebuilt, renamed, reclaimed. 44 times it has changed hands. 44 times the organism has survived the transaction. The question that the 21st century has not yet answered is whether the strategy that preserved Jerusalem for 3 millennia, being too meaningful to destroy, too contested to resolve, is a foundation that any future can be built on. Or whether, at some point, the weight of accumulated meaning becomes too heavy even for limestone to bear.